We love to think of our scientific geniuses as heroes, right? But what happens when one of them, maybe the man who literally gave us the concept of infinity, turns out to be a thief? What if the guy who built a new paradise for math stole the blueprint?
So, let's talk about Georg Cantor. This is the guy, the revolutionary thinker, who is credited with staring straight into the abyss of the infinite and completely changing mathematics forever. I mean, people said his work created a new paradise for mathematicians. It totally reshaped how we understand reality itself.
But was he also a thief? Yeah, it's a huge question. And it all comes down to a letter that was just discovered, after being lost for more than 100 years. And this letter suggests that the single most important paper of his entire career, well, it wasn't just his own work. It was straight-up plagiarism.
Okay, so how did this all come out? To really get why this accusation is such a big deal, our story actually starts not way back in the 19th century, but right now. Or, well, very recently, with a discovery that could literally rewrite a huge chapter of mathematical history.
So picture this, March 2025. A mathematician named Demian Goose is at the University of Halle. He finds this old, thin blue binder just tucked away, and inside, a letter dated November 30, 1873. This wasn't just any old letter. It was the missing piece of a huge puzzle, the smoking gun for an intellectual crime that historians had suspected for decades, but could never, ever prove. Until now.
Now, to really get why this is so explosive, we need to take a step back. We have to understand just how completely radical Cantor's ideas were at the time. I mean, we're talking about a period when the very idea of infinity was basically mathematical heresy.
You see, for pretty much all of history, mathematicians only dealt with something called potential infinity. Think of it like counting. 1, 2, 3. You can always add another number. It's a process that never ends. It's useful, but it's not a thing. Actual infinity, on the other hand? Whoa. That's the idea of a complete existing object, a set that contains all its members all at once. That idea was seen as dangerous, a paradox, an affront to logic. Some even thought it was an affront to God.
And this wasn't just some fringe idea. The great Carl Friedrich Gauss, one of the biggest names in math, put it perfectly. He basically said infinity is just a figure of speech, and the idea of a completed infinity has no place in mathematics. The message from the establishment was crystal clear. Stay away. Don't touch it. But a young, super ambitious Georg Cantor, he was about to challenge everything.
And here's the thing. Cantor didn't go on this crazy quest alone. His journey into this forbidden mathematical territory, it all started with a friendship, a really important friendship, built on a shared obsession.
So it's the summer of 1872. The tall, loud, boisterous Georg Cantor meets the shorter, much more reserved Richard Dedekind. They couldn't have been more different, really, but they hit it off immediately. Why? Because they both were fascinated by the same things, the very foundations of numbers, and, you guessed it, that forbidden idea of infinity.
And the main tool they used to explore this was actually surprisingly simple. It's called one-to-one correspondence. Think about it like this. If you're a waiter setting a table, you don't have to count the knives and then count the plates to see if you have enough. You just put one knife next to each plate. If everything pairs up perfectly, with nothing left over, you know the number is the same. Simple, right? But what happens when you try to do that with sets that are infinite?
Well, writing back and forth to each other, they made these mind-blowing discoveries. Dedekind proved that what we call algebraic numbers, that's stuff like whole numbers, fractions, square roots, they were countable. You could theoretically pair them all up one-to-one with the regular counting numbers. But then, Cantor dropped the bombshell. He proved that the real numbers, that's everything on the number line, including irrational numbers like pi, could not be paired up. There were just too many of them. It was a bigger, uncountable infinity. And this was the huge takeaway. Some infinities are bigger than others.
This was absolutely world-changing stuff. But Cantor, he was desperate for recognition, and he was also terrified of this one editor who was known to be super hostile to new ideas. So he made a decision, a really fateful one. He submitted their shared work to a top journal, but he erased every single trace of Dedekind. He put only one name on that paper, Georg Cantor. He just took Dedekind's crucial preliminary proof, stuck it together with his own, and claimed the whole thing was his and his alone.
And when that paper was published, boy, did it ignite a firestorm. A full-on professional war, and it was waged by one of the most powerful and frankly ruthless gatekeepers in all of European mathematics. Cantor's #1 enemy was a guy named Leopold Kronecker, who was actually his old teacher. Now, Kronecker was a total ideologue. He believed that God made the integers, and all else is the work of man. He ran one of the most important math journals, and he hated, and I mean hated, the idea of actual infinity.
And Kronecker's attacks weren't just academic disagreements. They were vicious. They were personal. He called Cantor a corrupter of the youth, a renegade. He saw Cantor's work as a sickness infecting the purity of mathematics. And he used every ounce of his power to block Cantor's career, to stop his papers from being published, and to just systematically ruin his reputation.
Now, in the long run, Cantor's ideas would win. They would absolutely triumph, creating this new paradise for math. But the man who created it, he would pay a devastating price for starting this revolution.
And yeah, eventually, his ideas won out. Decades later, another great mathematician, David Hilbert, would famously say, "No one will drive us from the paradise which Cantor created for us." Set theory became the foundation for basically all of modern mathematics.
But here's the tragic part. Cantor himself never really got to enjoy that paradise. The constant attacks from Kronecker, being isolated from his colleagues, and probably the guilt of what he did to his friend Dedekind, it all took a massive toll. He started suffering from these terrible bouts of depression and had to be hospitalized again and again.
He ended up dying in a sanatorium in 1918. In his last letters to his wife, he was begging to come home. By the end, his belief in the worth of his own life's work had just been completely shattered. I mean, the man who defined infinity died alone, feeling trapped and broken.
And that brings us all the way back to that letter in that dusty blue binder. Finding it doesn't erase Cantor's genius, not at all. But what it does do is give us a much more honest and, yeah, a much messier story. Because that letter is undeniable proof. It confirms what Dedekind had privately claimed years later, that his crucial contributions appeared almost word for word in Cantor's famous 1874 paper, with zero credit given. So that simple, clean story of the lone hero, it's officially broken.
And this really gets to the heart of the problem with these kinds of myths, right? The historian of mathematics, José Ferreros, put it perfectly. Every branch of science needs a hero, but that's always a lie. The real story is that science is a collective, human thing. It's messy, it's full of ambition and friendship and betrayal and just mistakes.
Look, Cantor's mathematical legacy is totally secure. The proof that some infinities are bigger than others, that was his, and it changed everything. But maybe the truer, more valuable story here isn't about a flawless hero. Maybe it's about a passionate, ambitious, and deeply flawed young man who made a huge mistake under immense pressure. And that leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? What do we lose when we demand our geniuses be perfect?